Hello, and welcome to Queer Crime, episode number 27. I'm your host, Patrick. Advance warning. This episode contains details of a violent crime, and language about transgender people that some people might find upsetting. The language used is the derogatory language that appeared in my research, and is included merely to highlight ignorant views of the people in this story. Please listen at your own discretion. It's 2014. Best Musical at the Tonys was A Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder. Outstanding Drama Series at the Emmys was Breaking Bad. Song of the Year at the Grammys was Royals, sung by Lorde. And Best Picture at the Oscars was 12 Years a Slave. The gay panic defense, or trans panic defense, is absolutely abhorrent. For those listeners who aren't familiar with this term, or for those of you who need reminding, the gay panic or trans panic defense is a legal strategy that asks the court to consider that a victim's sexual orientation or gender identity is to blame for a defendant's violent reaction, and this violent reaction can include murder. Essentially, it tries to claim that someone's sexual orientation or gender identity excuses any loss of self-control and the inevitable assault on them. Basically, it's an explanation put forward by some people for trying to get away with attacking or murdering an LGBT+ person. It involves a stupid defense along the lines of, I didn't realize they were gay, or I didn't realize they were trans. They never told me. When I found out, I panicked and attacked them, but I didn't mean to kill them. This defense is utter nonsense, and is used by the same type of stupid people who only eat in restaurants where there are pictures of food on the menus. In my view, allowing the gay panic or trans panic defense to continue implies that LGBT+ people are worth less than straight people. There's no such thing as straight panic defense. I can't believe I even have to say those words in 2021. The city of Olongapo in the Philippines has a long-standing reputation for being filled with fun, debauchery, boozy nightlife, and sex workers. The primary catalyst for this area to develop this reputation was the Vietnam War, which brought 10,000 GIs to the Philippines every day seeking sex, drugs, and everything in between. In order to satisfy this new demand, thousands of women arrived or were taken from rural areas to sell their bodies, ably assisted by thousands of young men who pimped and controlled the women. By the early 1990s, the sex trade in Olongapo was a major tourist attraction. Thousands of Westerners flock there every year to pay young women trapped by poverty to have sex with them. I'm no prude, but I do feel sorry for those young women who have such limited options other than to let some overweight beast flop around on top of them for less than $40. It's so grim. On the 4th of November 1987, Jennifer Laude was born in the province of Leyte in the Philippines. She was born male, but her birth name is irrelevant. Jennifer had two sisters, Michelle and Mary Lou, and they lived in a small house in a poor area. Jennifer's father died when she was 3 years old, and her mother soon remarried. Jennifer's family were open-minded and accepting about her gender identity. Their main concern was that Jennifer was a kind, responsible, compassionate and caring person, which she was, and not whether she was gay as they originally expected, or transgender as she later came out as. When she hit puberty, Jennifer embraced her identity and started dressing in more feminine clothing all the time. In 2006, when she finished high school, she moved to Olongapo to attend college. But her studies were delayed as she was looking for a school that would allow her to wear women's clothing and to grow her hair long. Eventually she enrolled at college as a human resources major, but she soon realized that this wasn't for her and she dropped out. She didn't drop out to do nothing though. Jennifer was a responsible young woman, and she got a job in a beauty salon in Olongapo. While she was at the beauty salon, she took a second job in the evening cleaning the same salon so she could send more money home to her family. She sent her wages back to her mother, who would use the money to feed their family and use the remaining money to make improvements on their run-down home. It was when Jennifer moved away that she confessed to her mother that she wanted to work hard because she wanted everyone back home to give her the credit that she was due. She wanted credit for being a responsible hard worker who added value to people's lives, and not the degenerate queer person that she was often called by people in their community. Unfortunately, the money that Jennifer was making from working 2 jobs wasn't great, so eventually she turned to sex work to get more money to send home and to save money for herself. By the end of 2007, Jennifer had saved enough money to get breast implants. In 2012, Jennifer met a German man online called Mark Susselbeck. Their relationship started rather tamely, and they chatted using audio only on Skype, but they quickly formed a strong connection. So much so that Mark announced that he had bought a ticket to the Philippines and he would be spending Christmas there. This is without knowing what Jennifer looked like, and similarly, she hadn't seen him. Jennifer was hesitant. She didn't want Mark to come all that way without disclosing who she was or what she looked like. Nervously, she sent him a photo with the caveat, quote, "I am what people call ladyboy or she-male, but I am just the girl for those people who see. Accept me as the girl I am, or don't. It's your choice, but I am me, and I will be proud of who I am and what I am if just the right guy shares it with me at my side." End quote. Mark was not remotely bothered by Jennifer's trans status, and he went ahead with the trip to the Philippines. They met for the first time at the airport, and on the 22nd of December, just 1 month after they had met and spoken online, Mark proposed to Jennifer on a stage at an Olongapo shopping mall in front of hundreds of people. This rather grand and somewhat cringeworthy gesture wouldn't be my cup of tea, but it was Mark's way to show Jennifer that he was not ashamed that she was trans. He wanted her to be his future. Jennifer was overjoyed. She accepted the proposal to be Mark's wife. For the next 2 years, Mark spent every bit of holiday time he had in the Philippines, usually visiting twice a year. In the summer of 2013, he applied for a German visa for Jennifer, but unfortunately, her application was denied. Mark and Jennifer were undeterred. They appealed the decision made by the German embassy, and they continued with their wedding plans nonetheless. During this time, Jennifer was honest about how she made money. If she was going to be Mark's wife, she couldn't have secrets from him. She confessed that she made money through sex work, or through showing her body on webcams. In order to get her away from sex work and to keep her safe from the harm that befalls many sex workers, Mark sent her an allowance each month. On the 1st of October 2014, the German embassy contacted Mark and confirmed that they were going to schedule an interview with Jennifer for her visa application. Just 10 days later, Jennifer was dead. On the 11th of October 2014, the US Marines who were aboard the USS Peleliu were granted their first night of freedom following military exercises. When their ship docked in the Philippine island of Luzon, US Marine Joseph Scott Pemberton, a 19-year-old from New Bedford, Massachusetts, excitedly disembarked the ship with his 3 colleagues. They headed to Olongapo, where they enjoyed an early dinner, did some shopping, and then headed to the livelier part of town to start drinking and partying. Later that evening, they ended up in a nightclub called Ambience Nightlife, where they found what they were looking for: sex workers. Among those sex workers was Jennifer. She was enjoying a night out with some of her friends for the first time in a few months since she had become engaged to her German fiancé, Mark. Just before 11 p.m, 19-year-old Joseph was drinking with his friends in the nightclub when he spotted Jennifer. Feeling brave and drunk, he approached her and her friend Barbie with the type of unfounded and unjustified bravado that you'd expect from a 19-year-old guy. After a very short period of flirting, they came to an agreement where Joseph employed the services of Jennifer. Within 2 minutes of meeting, they left the nightclub together and went to a nearby motel, Barbie accompanying them for safety and to help negotiate the price. When they got to the motel called the Cellzone Lodge, the receptionist was aware of what was going on and allowed them to hire room number 1, the room which was right beside the motel office. Barbie, in the meantime, met another man in the reception area and she hired a different room with him. 30 minutes later, Joseph walked calmly out of room number 1 without Jennifer and he left the motel. He didn't close the room door behind him, so the receptionist checked to see if Jennifer was okay. He could see Jennifer's shoes outside a bathroom door, so he assumed that she would leave the room too after she had freshened up. After 30 minutes had passed, Barbie had also returned to the reception area, and she was getting concerned that Jennifer wasn't out of the room yet. The receptionist decided to knock on the bathroom door. There was no response. He knocked on the door again. Still no response. He gingerly opened the door and he was confronted with a horribly frightening scene. He saw Jennifer naked on the floor with a bedsheet draped around her. Her head was submerged in the toilet. He immediately ran 1.5 blocks to the police station and summoned them. They turned up at the motel within minutes, entered room number 1, and they checked Jennifer. She was declared dead at the scene. Meanwhile, Joseph's friends were frantically looking for him because their midnight curfew for being back on the ship was rapidly approaching. They eventually left in a taxi without him, and they arrived at the ship 10 minutes past curfew. For being 10 minutes late, they received a stern talking to by their commanding officer, especially because Joseph wasn't with them. While they were being berated, Joseph arrived at the ship and he explained that they were all late because they had got separated and were looking for each other. Their commanding officer decided against disciplining them and dismissed them. When they were settling in for the night, Joseph asked one of his friends if he could have a chat with him in private. When they arrived at the open deck of the ship, he confided in his friend that he had picked up a girl and that when he got back to the motel, he realized that she had a penis. He said that he was so angry that he, quote, choked it from behind, end quote. He said that when the body stopped moving, he dragged her to the bathroom and left. He then said to his friend, quote, I think I killed a he-she, end quote. Back at the motel that was now swarmed with police, Jennifer's body was taken away to a local funeral home. Barbie sent a text message to Jennifer's sister, Michelle. Coincidentally, Michelle had been at the same nightclub that night with her own friends, so she was able to meet with Barbie immediately, and both of them made their way to the nearby funeral home where Jennifer's body was. Michelle, through her relentless tears, identified her sister's body. She had the unbelievably grim task of telling her family the horrible news that Jennifer was dead. Jennifer's mother, Yulita, left as soon as she could and made the 24-hour bus journey from the family's home to be with her daughters. The following day, an autopsy was performed on Jennifer. The autopsy report showed that she had been punched in the stomach and that she had been strangled. She had horrendous black and blue bruising all around her neck. She had no defensive wounds. She didn't put up a fight, or rather, she couldn't put up a fight. When she was unconscious from being strangled, her head was stuck in the toilet bowl and she drowned. Officially, drowning was the cause of death. Thankfully, the police knew very quickly who Joseph was due to the CCTV both at the nightclub and the motel. But this is where it starts to become an infuriating shitshow. Initially, the investigation moved slowly, far too slowly for Jennifer's grieving family. 4 days after Jennifer's death, the Filipino government didn't appear to be doing very much to provide any reassurance to Jennifer's family that they were building a case against Joseph, so her family decided to file murder charges themselves. They chose lawyers and allies who were strongly opposed to the ongoing American military presence in the country. As knowledge of the crime became public knowledge, there seemed to be a steady growth in sympathy for Jennifer and her family, despite the fact that the Filipino media and the public constantly described Jennifer as a man, and never acknowledged that she was transgender. They used her male birth name and referred to her as a gay man. But if Jennifer's murder did one thing, it started a debate in the Philippines about the dangerous reality for trans women, the violence that they face every single day, and how they are never treated equally. Of course, there wasn't sympathy everywhere. In Olongapo, the US Navy cancelled all shore leave. Cancelling all shore leave meant that bar and nightclub owners and the pimps that controlled the women were furious. They were furious that people as insignificant as Jennifer and her family were allowed to bring murder charges against a visiting member of the US military forces. These murder charges had significant commercial implications for business owners in the area. It was reported that Olongapo City lost $3.5 million in revenue during the period that shore leave was cancelled. The small business owners didn't think to blame Joseph for their financial losses, the Marine who had killed Jennifer. Instead, they blamed her and their family for the loss of business. A week after Jennifer was murdered by Joseph, thanks to the determination of Jennifer's family, a preliminary hearing was scheduled, and in attendance was her family and her fiancé, Mark. 2 witnesses were also present at the hearing: Jennifer's friend Barbie, who was with her on the night that she was murdered, and the receptionist of the motel who had found her body in the bathroom. Joseph didn't show up to the hearing. In fact, he didn't even leave the ship. His lawyer stated that he was under no obligation to attend the hearing, and he was only required to submit a response to the charges. You can already tell that this case is going to wind you up. The next day, Joseph was flown by helicopter from the ship to an armed forces facility called Camp Aguinaldo. Jennifer's family, her fiancé, and the growing number of LGBT+ activists who were supporting them were suspicious that Joseph might have already left the Philippines, or at the very least be planning to leave, so they went to Camp Aguinaldo in an attempt to speak to him directly, or to get confirmation that he was actually there. Of course, given that this was a heavily armed and heavily secured army base, there was no way that they were going to get in. Feeling that they were going to continue to be ignored, and that they would not be treated fairly, and the feeling that Joseph was being protected, Mark, Jennifer's fiancé, and her sister, Mary Lou, climbed the fence and broke into the facility. They didn't get far before they were apprehended, and Mark pushed a soldier who was blocking their entry into a building. Mark and Mary Lou voluntarily left the camp, and were assured that there would be no repercussions for trespassing. It was just an emotional time for them, and they were desperate for answers. However, the military decided to pursue action after the US ambassador Philip Goldberg intervened and called the trespassing incident very disappointing. The immigration office met with Mark and stated that he had agreed to voluntary deportation back to Germany. Mark stated that he had never agreed to voluntary deportation. Either way, Mark had to leave the country, and when he left, he was placed on a travel blacklist which prevented him from returning to the Philippines. He planned to return 6 months later on the 13th of March 2015, the date that he was due to get married to Jennifer. He was denied entry. On the 27th of October, almost 2 weeks after Jennifer's murder, another court hearing took place. Again, Joseph didn't show up at this hearing either. Joseph's team of lawyers tried to get the charges filed by Jennifer's family reduced from murder to manslaughter. This was rejected by the court. 2 months later, the prosecutor filed his own charges of murder against Joseph because there was evidence of cruelty, treachery, and abuse of superior strength. The next day after these charges were filed, a warrant was issued for Joseph's arrest. The Filipino government wanted Joseph in custody. However, it would be 2 days before Joseph gave himself up from his hiding place behind the secure walls of the army base. But he wasn't held in a harsh, hot Filipino prison. He was held in an air-conditioned 20-foot van that he would share with US military guards. The reason for this treatment may appear a bit odd. It all gets a bit complicated here, so bear with me while I try to explain it. Under the Visiting Forces Agreement, if a crime is committed by a visiting member of the forces, regardless of their citizenship, the Philippines has jurisdiction over that crime. However, if a member of the American forces commits an offence while they are on official duty, the US military takes authority. There was another complication about how and when Joseph committed his crime. He was visiting the Philippines as a member of the US forces, but he wasn't carrying out any official duties when he killed Jennifer. In fact, he was on shore leave. Essentially, the Filipino government tried to demand custody of Joseph, in the early days at least, but he didn't even leave the US Navy ship, and then when he did leave the ship, he wasn't held in custody in a Filipino jail. He was held in a military base in a lovely air-conditioned room with meals provided to him by his American colleagues. You can see why people were incredibly fucked off by this, because he was being given preferential treatment. Jennifer's murder trial began in March 2015, 6 months after she had died, and it would have to be done within a year of starting because that was one of the conditions under the Visiting Forces Agreement. There could be no delays. The first witness again was Barbie, Jennifer's friend who was with her that night. She told the court the story of how they all met in Ambien's nightclub, and they had left with Joseph soon after they met him. She explained to the judge and the teams of lawyers everything that had happened up to the point when she last saw Jennifer alive. The next witness called was one of the Marines who was with Joseph the night that he met Jennifer. He said that Joseph told him when he returned to the ship that he had strangled Jennifer and dragged her to the bathroom. It was this Marine who confirmed that Joseph had said, quote, "I think I may have killed a he/she," end quote. During his testimony, the Marine told the court that they were trained on how to strangle someone from behind using just their arm. This strangulation method would explain why Jennifer had no defensive wounds on her, and how she didn't seem to have put up a fight. When it was Joseph's time to take the stand, he confirmed that he did hire Jennifer for sex, but that he choked her in an act of self-defense when he discovered that Jennifer was biologically a man who was giving him a blowjob. He panicked. He strangled her in a fit of anger and rage. Jesus. Talk about fragile masculinity, Joseph. He said that he dragged her to the bathroom because he wanted to splash water on her face to wake her up. He finished by saying that he didn't kill her, and that she was alive when he left her. Tale as old as time. During the trial, 2 US forensic experts from the US Army Criminal Investigation Lab revealed that a condom wrapper found in the motel room had Joseph's fingerprints on it. The lubricant from the condom wrapper was identified as the same lubricant found in Jennifer's anus and on Joseph's penis. The condom also had fresh semen in it and fecal matter around it, which contradicted Joseph's story that he didn't know that Jennifer was transgender when they were having sex. The court case trundled on, with more testimonies, more witnesses, more evidence, and more delays at every turn by Joseph's defense team. They grabbed every possible opportunity they could to drag it out. Eventually, on the 1st of December 2015, 9 months after the court case started, and 14 months after Jennifer had been killed, the judge delivered the verdict. Joseph was found not guilty of murder, but Joseph was found guilty of manslaughter. Well, the term they used was guilty of homicide. The reason that he wasn't found guilty of murder was that there was some mitigating circumstances, such as Jennifer not revealing that she was transgender, which caused Joseph to act like he did in a classic case of trans panic defense. This is despite the fact that there was a used condom, seminal fluid, and evidence of penetrative sexual activity between Jennifer and Joseph. He must have known. The judge awarded Jennifer's family 4.6 million pesos in damages, or just under $100,000. This amount was to be paid by Joseph to the family to account for the loss of earnings from Jennifer because she had sent money home to support them, and also to cover costs that the family incurred for funeral expenses. As Joseph wasn't charged with murder, and he was only charged with homicide or manslaughter, he was sentenced to 6 to 12 years in prison. The following year, in 2016, this sentence was reduced to a maximum of 10 years in prison because Joseph appealed his sentence. Jennifer's family and her fiancé Mark were furious, but they knew that due to time limitations under the Visiting Forces Agreement and the fact that they couldn't fight the might of the US legal team, there was nothing more they could do. Their beloved Jennifer was dead, and Joseph, her killer, would be released from prison in 10 years. On Monday the 7th of September 2020, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte caused significant controversy when he pardoned Joseph for the murder of Jennifer. Joseph was just over halfway into his 10-year sentence, and he was released for good behaviour. Jennifer's family and their lawyer were outraged and said that the president's pardon created a mockery of the country's justice system. The family lawyer said, quote, "This is another injustice, not only to Jennifer Laude and family, but a grave injustice to the Philippine people. This is a travesty of Philippine sovereignty and democracy." End quote. It wasn't just Jennifer and her family who were outraged. LGBT+ rights groups around the world were also incensed by Joseph's pardon, and they released a collective statement which stated that the president's decision, quote, "sent a loud and clear message that a Filipino trans woman's life does not matter." End quote. And they are right. To this day, Filipino trans women are amongst the most discriminated against. They are marginalized, stigmatized, abused, assaulted, raped, and murdered. They are rounded up and used as entertainment at parties. They are paraded around in fake beauty pageants where they are mocked, jeered, and laughed at. All these women want is to live without the threat of violence, to earn a living for themselves and their family members, to be respected. They often live in hope that a foreigner will take them away from their world of misery and denigration. I think it's incredibly sad that they think a foreigner will help them or give them a better life, when it was foreigners who fucked up their country in the first place. At the time of recording, Mark is still not allowed in the Philippines, and he has not been able to visit the grave of his beautiful fiancée Jennifer. He has to celebrate her life on the 20th of November each year, the Transgender Day of Remembrance. Transgender Day of Remembrance is an annual observance that honours the memory of transgender people around the world who have lost their lives in acts of anti-transgender violence. Almost 4,000 trans and gender diverse people were killed in 75 countries between January 2008 and September 2020. This is only the reported number of murders of trans people. The unreported murders of trans people means that the number of victims is far higher. If there is one thing that you take away from this episode, please remember to note that date, 20th of November. Reach out to local LGBT+ charities in your area and ask them how you can support them with their plans for this important day. They will be delighted to hear from you. They need support from LGBT+ people and allies, not just on the 20th of November, but all year round. If you can't commit anything more than one day of support for an LGBT+ charity, then please just remember to support and observe the 20th of November anyway in your own way, the Transgender Day of Remembrance. The fight for equality and justice doesn't stop when this episode ends. Your support is always needed in your local area. At 9:15 a.m. on the 13th of September 2020, 25-year-old Joseph Scott Pemberton flew out of the Philippines. He is a free man. Did you know that there are 195 countries in the world, and that out of those 195 countries, it's still illegal to be a gay man in 72 of them? Did you know it's still illegal to be a gay woman in 44 of them? And did you know that any same-sex activity in 11 of them could result in a death penalty? Utterly shameful in the year 2021. Why are LGBT+ people perceived to be immoral heathens in those countries? It's because those countries are governed by assholes. The people in charge have the power to change the perception of LGBT+ people in their countries, but they don't. Instead, they actively ask for LGBT+ people to be outed, to be imprisoned, to be brutalized and raped, or to be killed by their families. You might think there is very little you can do. There is. Research any LGBT+ equal rights charity and support their causes. Research the projects undertaken by the United Nations to support the advancement of LGBT+ equality and inclusion overseas. There's always something you can do to support the voices of the silenced. You've only got one life, so why not live it by being helpful and kind? Until next time.